Hello and welcome to a special episode of No Small Roles, where we'll be diving into the deep world lore of Deullamir. Today we'll be discussing the creation myth, the passing of the first gods, and a long-forgotten cataclysm that occurred in our homebrew world. I'm David Knight, and today I'm joined by... I'm just throwing it out to you. Whoever answers first gets to go first.
Superfan Pippa.
And Daryl.
Hi guys!
Hi.
Hello, David.
This is very exciting. Thank you for joining me to discuss everything, pick apart everything that I've made up, and come to some more detailed answers about what has actually happened and what is in my brain. Are we all sitting comfortably?
Yes.
Indeed.
Then ready? Lore drop! The history of Deullamir. Before. There was no void. There was only a moment. And in that moment sat all of existence. Every possibility collided with every variable. Forces were created, were occurring, and were expended all at once. Beings cycled through endless lifetimes that never came to pass. And at the heart of this ordered chaos, four entities took control. The first, a being of infinite virtue, Sula, gathered the energies of noble morals and peaceful conditions and settled them in a celestial plane, where goodness reigned absolute. In counterpoint, the second, a creature of boundless malice, Rag, created an abyssal plane in which was caged all corrupt ideals and violent cruelty to lay waste as they saw fit. A spirit of limitless mystery, Io, drew in the wandering energies of playful curiosity and imaginative natures to an ethereal plane, that they may never be tethered to the rigid moralities of Rag and Sula. Seeing all that had been left behind, the fourth entity, a soul of creativity, Deus, began to craft a physical plane for them all to inhabit, and life was breathed into a singular world, and it was named Deullamir. The passing of the first gods. Deus began to people his world with those that had always existed. He found their first moments and began to order their lives, stringing out that singular moment into many. On seeing all of the potentialities falling to his feet, Deus decided not to discard them, but instead to weave them back into the design. Tying each finished string back to its first moment, he wove lifetimes over again, that each creature might see what could have been. He imbued Deullamir with his own powerful magics, and took great delight in witnessing the cycling lives take their first eager steps over and over again. And the other gods looked on, with burgeoning envy in their hearts. Millennia passed, and the first gods grew weary. Unlike the creatures of Deullamir, all else had no cycle of lifetimes, only a beginning and an end. Sula was the first to admit her failing strength, and guided the powers of her realm in forming a celestial council to rule in her stead. She retired in an eruption of grace and goodness that lasted an eternity. Rag was not so dignified, and refused to relinquish the abyssal throne to any monstrosity beneath him. He grew feeble, and the hungry eyes of malevolence began to plot his downfall. No one can say what became of Io. The vast question of her reality in the ethereal plane continued to be asked, and the others surmised that she had ceased to exist separately from it. After many thousands of years watching them grow, Deus decided to hand his power out to the creatures he had guided, calling forth those who were capable of commanding the powers of godhood. He offered a test to claim his different aspects. Little is known of who the beings were that rose to godhood, except that they forfeited their potential lives, and since their apotheosis, the new gods, Phalios, Sylvae, Tuvir, and Samsara, have kept the world in check. For a short time, this new paradigm endured, but the wary knew that danger lurked in the shadows of the abyssal throne. Indeed, as Rag dwindled in his power, the creatures he had commanded rose up against him and struck him down with ease. Now there came a void, and into it hurtled a devastating war.
Where do we start?
I mean, that's a very good question.
Where do we start? That's a lot.
Before we dip into questions, can I just give you a moment of appreciation for your phenomenal music that's gone behind this?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, sets the tone really well.
I mean, I could talk to you just about that all day, but we're not here to do that, so...
I mean, yeah, I tried to make it feel as epic and... Not ancient, that's the wrong word, but...
Epic's a good
feel
word.
the weight of the history behind it. Yeah.
Certainly.
Had a lot of fun putting that together.
Great sense of foreboding as well. It's like, that's history that's happened, but the effect in the world could still eke out in time to come.
Oh, and in many ways, it has. And does.
And will still.
Yeah. So, should we start at the very beginning? I hear it's
a very good place to start. Music geeks in the room.
Yeah. So, yeah, right at the very beginning, it starts with not a void, but with everything. That's my thinking.
Yeah, when I first listened to this and I sat and made some notes as I was listening through, it sort of struck me as like a blending of almost like a biblical beginning, but then with elements of like the Big Bang Theory thrown in as well. Was that kind of your intention? Was that conscious?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of sort of when you read sort of creation myths, it's always that there's nothing is there and then something suddenly appears. Or like the thing that was there then gives birth to everything else. So I was trying to think of like a more novel approach to that. And I really like the idea in a sort of like a physics sense that all energy that there is constant and that like energy can't be created. It can only be converted. Please don't shout at me, physicists. I'm sure that's not necessarily correct. So like I liked the idea that sort of applying that to like in a creation way, that everything that could ever possibly be already exists.
Yeah.
It just has no order. It is pure chaos, and it's all sort of compressed into a single thing that has no control or has no purpose almost, and that it takes the first gods, the greatest beings, to pull that apart to try and make sense of it all. Like rather than have nothing and then everything springing out of nothing, why not just start with everything? That was kind of my thinking behind it.
Cool.
So you have 4 spirits or 4 beings. Was there a specific one that you kind of envisaged first, or did you have an idea and then created a being to fit with that? Why 4, basically?
I think it started with the sort of traditional D&D planes, that you've got the celestial plane, the abyssal plane, and the ethereal plane, and then the physical or the material plane. Those 4 are standards in D&D lore.
Yeah.
There are then extra planes on top of that. You get sort of the elementals, and then you get sort of the astral sea and all loads of extra stuff. I was trying to think of how to almost simplify all of that down into just like an understandable set, because there's far too many for my brain in sort of like canonical D&D.
Yeah.
So I started with like, and again, it kind of ties into almost like a sort of heaven-esque place echoed by the hell version, sort of celestial and the abyssal. Our world being sort of in the middle of the physical, and then the ethereal kind of wrapping around everything.
Okay.
And then from there, once I decided that that was like sort of the structure of the planes, to try and think of how they came into being. And I figured it would be nice if each of those places was like sort of had come from a being that wanted to like embody everything that those planes were about. So I suppose, the decision of the first 4 gods actually just came from the necessity of the planar structure of the universe that this is all set in. And then, again, looking at traditional D&D lore, kind of smushed a few things together. So the abyssal plane, for instance, is where all of the demons and devils exist. Yeah. It's sort of anything that is sort of malevolent or slightly corrupt, violent. They don't even necessarily have to be creatures. Just sort of those energies and those intentions stem from that place. And in opposite, in the celestial plane, all of those sort of like ideals like justice and peace and those kind of like things that we traditionally consider to be good, sort of situated there. And then obviously sort of the having decided at least that there was a being in charge of all of those places, how they are and like their intentions kind of just stemmed from what their values were and what their plane represented. So Sula is obviously very good and peaceful. So when then she passes on, she does it in a very graceful way because that is embodied in the celestial plane. Whereas, Rag, who is very much about greed and paranoia and all of those kind of like less pleasant things, like he wouldn't want to give up his power and so holds on. And then Deuce, the name Deuce is actually, it's a real world thing.
Yeah, I thought so. You sent us players the world notes a few months back, and that one always stuck. I didn't want to like look it up. I actually wanted to be a bit more ignorant about this, like discovering the game maybe.
Yeah, so Deuce is a Proto-Indo-European figure who is a daylight sky god.
Oh.
So in our own history, he's kind of like the forerunner for mythological characters like Zeus.
I thought so.
It's where the name Zeus comes from, is Deuce. But
makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily, for ours, even though I've sort of used the he, him pronouns for Deuce, I don't necessarily consider him, even though, again, I'm calling him him. He's not necessarily masculine in like a sort of a fathery traditional way, like as it has been in our world.
Would you say, and this is not me calling you out or anything, that maybe your habitual given the gods pronouns is kind of like a reflection of what stereotypically gender roles are assigned to? So like morals of care and peace, people stereotypically attribute those to be like feminine ideals.
Sula,
yeah. So is that kind of part of it? I mean, like for a human mortal level understanding, like they aren't of a gender that we could probably comprehend, but because they embody those values that we identify those with a certain gender, they become that gender in human understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, they are completely like creations of my own bias. Again, it is fascinating that, like you say, they are just entities of emotion and ideals and values and things. They're not gendered in any way. And yet I do keep finding myself referring to Sula as she, referring to Io, who is sort of imaginative and creative and all about curiosity, again, in a very feminine way. Whereas Rag, who is more violent, and Deuce, who it comes from this Proto-Indo-European father figure. Again, I'm referring to them as masculine, which, I see what you mean. It's interesting that those sort of structures are things that naturally, at least in, again, my biases, like refer, like that's what I consider to be sort of the more feminine and more masculine energies. But ultimately, they're not. These beings are far greater than that kind of comprehension. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like until I'd written it all down, I didn't necessarily realize that that's how I was breaking them down in my head either. But it is fascinating to see.
So I'm kind of intrigued, within the passing of the first gods, how do you define passing? So is this like a changing of energy or form? Because we mean passing sometimes as like dying.
I feel like with Sula, she's got the most definitive death, as it were, even though sort of it's described as erupting into grace and glory and basically existing in eternity as this eruption of goodness. I feel like that is a very definite death, as it were. But like as you sort of say, it is like it's not necessarily like sort of the soul has left her or anything like that, because she exists as an entity, as an ideal. So yeah, I feel like hers is a death. She stops existing basically, and all of the energy that made her up again is sort of used in her celestial plane. Io again, similarly. No one quite knows what happened to her, but
I was going to ask, do you know?
Yeah, well, I really like the idea that if she's questioning everything all the time, that at one point she just questioned herself. Just became a question.
Oh, I like that.
Stopped being a fully formed thing and became the question about what she is, and therefore is kind of like transcended again, even though she's probably one of the highest forms of creature of thing in this world. That she's just become a question in and of herself.
That's really clever. I like that.
Rag again does have a very definite death in that he is struck down by all of the creatures that he's drawn to him. He is murdered, for want of a better term. He is fully destroyed by everything that he'd drawn close to him. That's the danger of surrounding yourself with violence, really. And Deuce hasn't actually died.
Didn't think so.
He has neither died or passed on. I don't go into it in this history. He is just waiting, because whilst the 4 gods that rose up to take sort of aspects of him, they didn't take everything. And so he's just waiting for anyone else who has the strength enough to rise to godhood.
Okay.
So that is possible for anyone in the world, anyone in Deullamir. If they are powerful enough to take it on or like face the challenge, then he'll sort of call them forwards in one way or another and let them try their hand at sort of stepping up. He's not in charge anymore, basically. He's retired, is what he's done. He's retired and he's got loads of books and he's just waiting to hand books out to people.
Yeah. That's cool. Gives them a kind of like a mortal kind of aspect in terms of like they can get tired. Like it's even in biblical terms, you know, God created the world in 6 days and on the 7th he rested. Like, you know, like God doesn't need rest. He's omnipotent and all powerful, but he still took a day off.
Yeah, he had a day. He had a day to himself. He worked hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
So none of these beings or gods are they omniscient just within their own planes? Or do they have any kind of sense of foresight of what goes on outside of their own planes?
No, I think where they've kind of like drawn things to themselves to build their own spaces, that there are some barriers between them all. So whilst they probably communicated with each other in some way, I can't imagine constantly necessarily it was a friendly fashion, but what like there was some like awareness of what the others were doing. There wasn't necessarily power to stop them in any way. And at least in this kind of like prehistory era, that definitely wasn't an issue. Everyone was just more concerned with their own projects almost. Their own little planes, their own questions.
Okay. Because, I wondered whether any of the other 3 would have been able to predict, like, the uprising of the abyssal demons or anything like that.
I can imagine they
knew it was coming.
Probably knew it was coming.
Yeah.
But, you know, like, again, if you're going to surround yourself in danger and with sort of horrible things, those horrible things are probably going to do horrible things to you.
It's not going to go well for long, is it?
No. But whether or not they actually stopped or, like, tried to help in any way, I don't know. There might have been some like, oh, be careful, but like ultimately, like they are sort of constructions of these different viewpoints. So even if one of them did offer any advice, the others probably fully ignored them because they knew better. Like they knew about what they wanted and didn't want to hear the others' opinions in that way.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you have a clear distinction between old gods and the new. Where the world is in timeline of the No Small Rose campaign, how aware of the mortals on the land aware of the old gods? If the religions of the new gods are the ones that we've heard are practiced in that time.
I think the more academic religious scholars will probably have some awareness. And historians would, because of the devastating war that that comes from the fall of Rag. That caused a lot of issue across the plains, as we will shortly be hearing. But I think, in everyday folk who are like sort of following the teachings of the new gods, they probably don't have any awareness that there were gods before them.
Okay.
And again, like all of this is millennia ago. So it really is the longest lived races and species might have some awareness of it, but even they would have forgotten because it's been so many generations.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think sort of, it's sort of, that's the split. Anybody who's like super looking into it and researching it probably find evidence of all of this stuff. But anybody who is just living their lives has no idea that this is all going on. Yeah.
Can we hear what happens next?
Yeah, shall I play it for you?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
The Hell King Wars. In the heart of the Abyssal Plain, factions of demonic and devilish fiends began to form and tear into each other. And with no being to command the corrupt energies, the decay of the Abyss began to contaminate the other planes. Plagues seeped across the borders of existence, twisting creatures into wicked forms. And creeping into the hearts of mortals came greed, paranoia, and rage. Of all the contenders of the throne, 2 monstrosities emerged as potential heirs, and they each built formidable armies to continually wage war. Bastagesh was cruel, calculating, and vindictive, forming underhanded alliances in his pursuit of power. His opponent, Makol, was wild, wrathful, and vicious, choosing to command his followers through fear alone. Neither was willing to submit, and as battle after battle was fought, the lines that had been drawn by the first gods began to falter. Called to a summit by the Celestial Council, the new gods briefly stepped away from their duties to discuss how to prevent the spreading disaster. Should they take a side in the fight, or elect an emissary of their own to wrest control of the Abyss? As they deliberated, the war between Bastagesh and Makol roared into the ethereal plane. Whilst spreading malevolence through the realm of imagination, the battling fiends often became confused and lost more warriors to the wandering nature of the plane than to their opponents. On noticing a dreaming veil between the ethereal and the physical, and with the new gods momentarily absent, the violence took hold of Deullamir, and the monstrosities poured in. The people of Deullamir fought valiantly to protect their world, even as the land beneath them was torn asunder. A company of champions was forged to hold the line and drive back the horde. And even with the return of the new gods and a host of celestial warriors, victory was not certain. Seeing the untapped energy of the physical plane as a weapon to be claimed, Bastagesh turned his gaze to Deullamir to consume its essence. Adamant that the life of the world lay solely in her hands, Samsara, the new god who wove the cycle of strings, stepped in before him and sacrificed herself to force Bastagesh back into the abyss. With her death, she was reborn as the Shrouded Lady, a shadow of her former self, and the final battle of the Hell King Wars began. The company of champions were joined on the battlefield by the new gods, who bent the laws of the plane to breaking point to ensure victory. Eventually, the abyssal armies were pushed back to their own domain, and the barriers between the planes sealed shut once again. Those who were caught on the wrong side of the wall hid themselves away, even as they were hunted. With Bastagesh weakened from his vain attempt, Makol gleefully tore him apart, claiming victory and the abyssal throne before naming himself Hell King Eternal.
Hell King.
Fascinating.
There are two words that jump out at me, David. Those two words are the words torn asunder. And my question, without asking you for any spoilers, is whether that has anything to do with the note that the company found in the underground tower, or whether it's just a cool phrase.
There's many ways things can be torn asunder.
Yeah.
No, I think that's just me really liking that phrase.
Okay.
There is no connection, no connection.
I wonder whether there was, flames, floods, and the dead rising, whether there was any kind of reference to this big battle.
I think that's just how I've envisaged huge cataclysms, those like literally the land being ruptured and torn apart, and sort of all of those natural disasters kind of taking the forefront and just destroying people's lives in that way.
Like the meteorite that hit the dinosaurs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Volcanoes erupted and everything. It was insane. That's a cataclysm.
Yeah. That's genuinely what I've sort of pictured, and people trying to live through that can't even grasp it in my own mind. So, no connection to a prophecy.
On behalf of the superfans, I had to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea for the Hell King Wars overarching is it's a way for everything to kind of become a little bit more mixed, a little bit more blended, all of the planes kind of reaching into each other's influences a bit. So things like disease and greed and paranoia and rage and all of those kinds of things maybe didn't necessarily exist in our world, in Deullamir, before this event. And that it has kind of, I suppose it's like a Pandora's box kind of moment, in that all of the bad things were released, but ultimately sort of everything is vaguely brought to some safety at the end. But unfortunately, the danger has sort of been unleashed on the world anyway.
Yeah.
So you've revealed in this that Samsara is the Shrouded Lady. Have you made any decisions on the other new gods as to their possible pasts?
Not particularly, actually. Samsara, again, is a word from our sort of real world sort of religions. It's a concept about sort of cycling life and death, and kind of those kinds of karma and reincarnation and those things from a lot of Indian religions. It's used in sort of Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, I think. And when I decided on the cycle of strings and how that works in this world, I was trying to find like a word or a name that would represent her in that way. And whilst I danced around the word samsara for ages, it's also a really beautiful film as well.
Okay.
There's no words in the film. It's just like sort of imagery from around the world. So like the word was in my head already. But the cycle of life and death and rebirth, there is really only that word to describe it in that way. And also just then diving into all of those sort of real world sort of beliefs is absolutely fascinating and 100% worth reading into. Genuinely, read further than the Wikipedia page, everyone. It is fascinating stuff.
Yeah. We've gone away from it a little bit, but I thought, because you use cycle of strings, there's terminology. I wonder if you could quickly like just explain and expand on why that's important.
Yeah, I feel like it's vaguely come up in various conversations we've had before, right? So for me, the cycle of strings is a way to get around players having free will, but also being able to put in a prophecy in place. So in Deullamir, and this is just in Deullamir, in the physical plane, this does not apply to the celestial or the abyssal or the ethereal plane. This is just in sort of in the world. When a person is born, they live a full lifetime, and then when they reach the end of their lifetime, they are put back to the beginning again. And they can play through their entire lifetime again, but make a different choice. They can see what the other paths are, and they can do that over and over and over and over and over again, as many times as they like, sort of looping round and round to relive their lives. They're not necessarily reincarnated like down the timeline in that sort of sense. They're sort of stuck in the moment that they're born to a possible end to their life, but they can do that as many times as they wish. And yeah, like for me, that means that you can lay out a prophecy and say, oh, these things are going to happen in the timeline, but whether or not like sort of that combination of strings is tied in the right way really then has an effect on whether or not that prophecy does happen. Like in one selection of strings, or like crossing the strings in any way, like it might go really badly. I like the idea that it also kind of ties into like divination magics, that glimpsing a moment in your future is like looking down the string that you're on to see what happens next, which is partly where Kral reached his comeuppance, because he was looking at too many different possibilities. Yeah. He was looking across the strings rather than just like down the one he was on. Yeah, he was searching for answers that he didn't have, but he knew he could possibly have somewhere, and that kind of messed with him a bit. That's why he's sort of a little bit more unhinged, unfortunately. Yeah. But yeah, I like the idea that it means that your life has a purpose, but also that you can choose what you're doing, because ultimately if you make the quote unquote wrong choice, when you like sort of relive your life, you can make a different choice and things might turn out better for you.
That's cool. That's great.
You're blowing my mind, David.
I was going to really like bring down the IQ of the conversation by referencing Doctor Strange.
Go for it.
So basically Doctor Strange in Avengers, when he like he did the finger thing and he looked through the timeline with the timestamp.
Absolutely.
But your explanation was way better and way more relevant.
Well, no, and I like thinking of it like when you're playing a video game, for instance, when you make a mistake and you go back to a save point. Like it's that kind of like aspect. There is a version of you playing right the way through the game without making any mistakes, and you get to the end of the story and it's all great. And then there's all of the attempts along the way that just haven't happened.
You're like, yeah.
So that's what the cycle of strings is, which is why obviously then Samsara was so willing to sacrifice herself to protect that, because that's sort of like the core of Deullamir, the core of what the world runs on. So if anyone's trying to tamper with any of that, that could really mess with stuff. But her being a goddess, her being this sort of having risen to godhood, she still exists, but is, like I say, reborn. She almost, in my head, when all of the four gods sort of move up and take over from Deus, they give up their string, so they no longer have the option to start again.
Okay.
But with enough power as she had, and being in charge of life and death and rebirth and all the rest of it, she kept herself going, but in a much more reduced form than she was. Which is why she's now the Shrouded Lady, because she's sort of Grim Reaper-esque now.
Yeah.
This is very cool.
Yeah.
I have a question about your barrier between the physical and the abyssal plane. So do you envisage it being opened again, potentially, either by gods or by mortals?
Potentially.
And I'm also more intrigued about people being kind of trapped on the wrong side of the wall. Do you have anything more specific about that in mind? So do they like exist in those planes properly? Do they kind of wither and die? Are they there to kind of cause chaos or?
So a lot of this sort of like world lore, I actually was creating when writing the 6-7 year campaign that I've been playing with Vicky.
Okay,
Because that whole storyline revolves around an attempt to take over this plane again. So I was like, well, I should probably come up with the answers for how that would work. So ultimately, you can just about cross through the barriers. It's much more difficult nowadays. It's basically there was a time when you couldn't, when everybody sort of the first gods were in charge, and then as they passed on, it kind of weakened, so that caused all of this disaster. And then walls have been put up, but they're not as strong as they originally were. And in sort of a long story short, in the campaign I've been playing with Vicky, Lolth, Spider Queen, manages to sort of make it through and tries to take over the cycle of strings so that she could be in charge of this plane.
Ooh.
Yeah, and basically the entire issue is stopping her from succeeding in doing that, in rising to become the goddess of life and death herself. As it stands currently in that campaign, that has all gone completely wrong. All of the barriers are completely broken, and they're in a dystopian, almost like Hell King Wars Mark II
Oh no.
type of situation.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
Where does this sit compared to our 5?
So this sits probably about 200-300 years ago.
Okay.
Oh, what?
Okay.
Yeah, not long history.
Oh, I thought it was in the future. Oh
No. This is in past.
no.
But this
Oh,
is
no.
this is the fun thing about the cycle of strings, you see, is that I can have a very disastrous campaign in one cycle of strings and
Okay.
it not affect the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Unless you
yeah,
want it
that's
to.
right.
Unless I wanted to. Yeah, they're kind of operating slightly outside of this of the cycle at the moment because of this disaster.
Okay.
But yeah, as for things being trapped on either side, so again, as part of that story, during the Hell King Wars, Lolth was a general of Bastagesh who lost.
Okay, cool.
She, in turn, had 8 demonic generals, and they were all captured in artifacts, basically, soul vessels. And those still exist in our world, in Deullamir.
Ooh.
Yeah. So they're very old, they're very powerful, but there are at least 8 artifacts out there with demons inside of them.
I want one.
And that's it. Sort of Enkidu goes off, just goes demon hunting. Right? But it works both ways, that some of the warriors who were trying to defend this world also got stuck on the other side, and they just had to survive, basically. And whether or not they survived by integrating, by, I don't know, hiding, who knows. But they are also trapped out there as well. And also, in some way, it explains how creatures and species like tieflings and Aasimar and Dragonborn can exist, because their influences, again, would have come from other planes. And during the Hell King Wars, kind of all of those things kind of got mixed. So, like, sort of, it's been a long time since then, and everyone's developed their own species, but that's where a lot of those sort of species have their origins, are in these moments where extraplanar influences have kind of like rushed through the world. Yeah, as it stands, though, any creatures that are trying to reach through, the gods have got it sorted at the moment. There are barriers there that are defended, and it's really only the really underhanded or the almost minuscule threats that manage to just slip through, but then, like, they're let through because it's known that the people on either side can deal with them. And anybody that is trying to reach through to demonic entities are obviously going to sort of face that wrath in some way. They've got a... It's a dangerous thing to even attempt, so why you would do it, I don't know.
Power.
Arrogance,
Yeah.
all of those things. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, as it stands, again, sort of in all of the planes now, you've got McColl on the abyssal throne, lording over everyone. You've got the Celestial Council ruling in a very democratic kind of way in the Celestial plane, the 4 gods running things here, and then who knows what's happening in the ethereal plane. Who knows? That's a free for all, that.
Great.
I suppose that really only leaves the last section from then until now.
Yeah.
If you want to give it a listen.
Let's hear it.
The ages that followed. Even with insight from the God of Knowledge, cataloguing and understanding events has been difficult, and mystery still pervade the world, with empires rising atop fallen cultures and victors erasing the defeated, leaving the truth in shreds. In studying the world, the academics of Deullamir have divided their history into 6 periods. Prehistory, the time before the new gods when the world was still young. Understanding the true origins of species relies on finding answers from this era. Though as the gods had not yet taken up their mantles from Deus, even they do not know everything from this time. The Mythic Era. This era began with the apotheosis of the new gods, and lasts until the end of the Hell King Wars, roughly 5,000 years ago. With the influx of interplanar influences, new species came to exist on Deullamir, and the land was reformed to resemble its current appearance. Scant records exist of civilizations at this time, as the turmoil of the Hell King Wars kept the entire world in chaos. The Rekindling. A 1,000-year period of rebuilding the world. New countries and cultures were established, new species pulled themselves away from their demonic, ethereal, and celestial heritage, and there was a new understanding of how things were to be going forward. The Age of Antiquity. A time of magical discovery and cultural expression. The countries of the Rekindling grew to become new kingdoms and empires. Nations warred against their neighbours, and few living had memory of the horrors that had befallen the world. This age ended around 2,000 years ago. The Colonial Era. With dominant ideologies claiming swathes of their local land, colonists spread across the world to plant flags wherever they wished. Influence of smaller cultures was diminished even further in favour of the powerful, and even more was forgotten in the grab for resources. The Modern Age. Starting with a definition of Deulamir's 18 regions nearly 500 years ago, the Modern Age has been marred with an attempted usurpation of the gods and a growing influence of interplanar entities. Fundamentally, the world remains intact, but for some academics, there is a rising fear as to what could bring about an early end to the age. The current year is known globally as 486 MA, with Dravain naming the year D624, 624 years since its foundation. In early spring, our heroes arrive in Deullamir, and their story begins.
That about brings us up to where we are now.
Fantastic.
I was trying to figure out how to break up like an entire world's history. Because obviously like ours, you say, the Renaissance era or staples set periods of time that have like a very definitive change from beginning to end.
Yeah, and I think you've done that quite clear, do you know what I mean? Like change in motivation, a dominance of mortals rather than gods or celestial beings, like domineering and like maneuvering the world events. It's more people led.
Yeah. That was like the intention. It was to try and make it like as this entire thing's gone on, it started at the sort of the very top and it's slowly sort of come down to just now it's people. Yeah, like you say, it started with world creating entities. And it sort of brought it down to just our heroes ready to go on their adventure. Yeah.
I really like that, though.
Yeah, and trying to find, like, sort of ways in which sort of these things would happen. So, 6 eras: prehistory, the Mythic Era, the Rekindling, the Age of Antiquity, a Colonial Era, and then the Modern Age, which the Modern Age sort of starting with proper, almost like continental lines being put on the world map.
Yeah.
And seeing sort of these are the different cultures now as they stand.
So does that timeline-wise, does that fit in with like the signing of the Accords and the creation of the consortium and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that actually happens toward the end of the colonial era, the previous era. So it's 486 modern age, but for Dravain has existed for 624 years.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, as part of El Timpir specifically, the entire region, as part of this sort of colonial moving around. I know this sounds weird, I feel like the word colonial has a lot of weight to it, especially these days where everyone's sort of readdressing and rethinking the damage that can do.
Yeah.
And it's something that I genuinely want to explore, like sort of how it has affected people, and even in a fantasy world, like how those conflicts are ongoing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, and how they're still damaging. So for El Timpir, it started, their sort of like major colonial moment was that elves from a different region were kind of kicked out of their space, decided to land in El Timpir, and took over the place. But then that led to the Mortal Uprising, which was the war between the Aelish Empire and then the Free Peoples, who then formed into Dravain. So that's kind of, why Dravain is sort of like just formed at the end of this whole colonial space. But the entire region is still referred to as El Timpir, as an old empire, by sort of more global academics and politicians. Like, that's why this whole corner of the world has been grouped together, even though Aeland and Dravain and Orkosh really don't like each other. Those three spaces are not a happy region in that way. It's not a peaceful region at the very least.
Very familiar.
Yeah. So in the Mythic era, when you say land was reformed to resemble its current appearance, what did it look like before? Is that just like a physical thing?
Yeah. So again, like comparing it to world history, the difference between Pangaea and the current world map.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so tectonic plates and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That because of the upheaval and the war caused by this interplanar fight, that the land was literally reshaped. It was a completely different structure. There are a couple of places, for instance, that I know specifically were, for instance, there's a place in Sylvam called the Carbon Mountains, which was created during the Hell King Wars as a barrier in the middle of an ocean. They just raised, like sort of as part of the fight, they raised an entire range of mountains.
That's so cool.
To sort of stop boats getting to where they were. That kind of thing is that literally as part of the fighting, the land was physically changed. It was reformed. But since then, since all of that fighting has stopped, it's not had a lot of change. It's only been sort of 5,000 years, and in that there's sort of, your natural like coastlines shifting and all the rest of it, but the odd earthquake and flood and that kind of thing, but not quite in the same way.
As God's tearing up the land, literally.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I need to redraw the world map, really. I've got a couple of versions of it, but the prominent one that I've got at the moment is just absolutely covered in scrawls from like notes of locations that it needs to be tidied up a lot. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
I should do that, and I'll chuck it up on the socials.
Where in the hemisphere is El Timpir?
So El Timpir is southern hemisphere.
Okay.
And if you're looking at it on a sort of an A4 page, because surprise, surprise, that's what I drew the map on. It's the southeastern corner of the world.
Okay.
On an A4 map, at least.
Great.
I'm sure there's one up there, but I don't think I've ever come across a world map.
No, I've never seen one either.
No, I don't think I've put that out there. Just the El Timpir map.
Okay, yeah.
And the Dravain map,
For reasons.
For reasons. Really, because I've got very little story planned for the other
Where's
regions of the world.
Offerville? Where can I find Splinter Falls? Offerville. Spent a good year of my actual real life there.
That's the thing, is that part of the fun of like having an entire world is that when sort of I am playing these other games, me and Daryl, we play sort of in an actors group as well. That's how we started playing together. That's set in the sort of northwestern region. So like literally the opposite corner of the map, and it means that I can sort of still create new places constantly. That's like scratch that itch of world building. And even sort of Daryl's run a few games for us that again are sort of set in slightly different regions as well, that like I've just said, have fun at it. I don't know what's happening in that place. Make up what you want.
Great.
Go for it.
Very grateful.
So out of your 18 regions, how many have you played in? How many are kind of vaguely formed? How many have you not touched at all?
Oh, that's a good question. So I've played in 10.
Okay.
And as part of playing in those 10, there have been conflicts with 2 more.
Okay, cool.
3 more, really. It's a discussion for a slightly different time, but I've got a breakdown of all 18 regions and at least something that makes up the core of what that region is.
Yeah.
There is nothing better than real world culture. Humans in our world are fascinating, and they have like anthropology is an absolute jam of mine. I love it. For instance, I've got one that's like, what if the Wild West was mostly run by Bavarian Germans,
Cool.
but also that they were all orcs as well?
Sick.
Amazing.
So it's just a mixture of like Bavaria meets cowboys meets sort of traditional orc stuff, all sort of like thrown in together to see what that sort of works like.
Love that.
Nice.
Yeah, I love finding those contrasts and the connections from disparate places and seeing what can come of that. And yeah, again, there is nothing greater than real world culture. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
I can't possibly make up everything that the world has already made up. The world is glorious and worth celebrating.
Yeah.
So yeah, but like I say, we'll have a different discussion about that. That's what we'll do. Is we'll do another one of these, and I'll just chat through the whole world.
Part 2.
A visitor's guide.
Yeah.
A traveler's guide. Yeah. A traveler's guide.
Well, like the Hitchhiker's Guide.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any last questions before we wrap up?
I have one last question.
Yeah, go on.
And I think you kind of vaguely touched on it, but I'll ask it anyway. So the very first chapter, when we talked about prehistory and all the things that happened well before, you obviously said that it's quite hard for the people of the modern age to know the truth and to kind of understand what went on before the new gods. Do you kind of envisage that there are mages kind of working on finding answers to these questions, or is it more that there are just old wives' tales being passed down from generation to generation type thing?
Yeah, I do think there's definitely people hunting for answers. Whether or not that's just in like an archaeological style, like digging through Deullamir itself, or those people that are reaching out to other planes to see if like the answers lie beyond their own world. There's definitely that kind of thing.
Because it makes sense with a world that has magic would be using magic to try and find those answers.
To communicate, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that there are some long-lived creatures that might have been told things, and that's what a lot of the research is all based on. But yeah, ultimately, whether or not they're finding the right answers or they're just walking themselves into more danger is really what the question is.
Brilliant.
Oh, thank you, David. This has been brilliant.
Yeah, thank
That's
you.
okay. Thanks for letting me ramble at you both for the last hour.
Oh, it's been fun and educational.
And informative.
Educational, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to go away with more questions than I came in with now, but
Yeah.
I'm going to hastily scribble some answers to stuff that I'm like, I didn't think about.
yeah, for another time.
Demons in a stone. Right, find it.
Yeah. Giving Daryl all the ideas.
Summon it.
There we go. Shall we sign off with the traditional 3-word?
I guess so.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and
Anon for now.
I love how that kind of turns into a slow-mo.
Yeah, exactly.
Timing.